This week, the backbench Labour MP in the UK House of Commons, Kim Leadbeater, introduced a bill to legalise what is called assisted dying, or I suppose you could call it assisted suicide. The terminally ill adults end-of-life bill would make it possible, with important safeguards in place, for people who knew they were imminently no longer for this world, who had only excruciating pain or abject conditions to expect in the meantime, to be helped to die. It's one of those difficult moral questions which invoke passionate and considered arguments on both sides. So let's discuss the issue and the likelihood that this bill will actually become UK law. The argument for the bill starts with the contention, as you would expect, that the status quo is not satisfactory. Right now, some UK citizens have travelled abroad, usually to Switzerland, to avail themselves of the ability to die peacefully under medical supervision. People who help them to travel can be convicted of assistance. The fact that travel is required at all means that some people have felt the need to go earlier than they otherwise might have while they are still capable of travel. The bill's proponents argue that terminally ill people should have the personal autonomy to choose how they die, that this would help people to avoid extreme suffering and forcing people to endure agonies for their last months. It's simply, they say, an act of legal cruelty. They also argue that the time has come where there is broad popular support for the measure, something that has indeed been supported by recent opinion polls. The arguments against start with a sense that once you've created a system for killing people, the scope of how and why that gets offered may easily spread. Pressure could be put on vulnerable people, such as the elderly or disabled, to end their lives so as to avoid being a burden. Whatever safeguards the law can create may simply not be adequate to protect against coercion or exploitation, they say. And it could become in itself a slippery slope where the eligibility criteria just get wider over time, ultimately ending up in places that the bill sponsors today would never have wished for. There's also the fact, they say, that often we hear of doctors' assessments of serious illness not being accurate. People have been told they have only months left to live, and yet those people have gone on to still be in good shape even a decade later. I know one person who fulfills that criteria myself, so the possibility must be strong that some decisions on ending their lives could be based on a faulty prognosis. There are plenty of places where assisted dying in some form or another is already legal. In Europe, Spain and Austria were added to that list just in the last couple of years. It's been legal in Canada since 2016, legal in 11 of the states of the United States, and a number of other places. In general, support for assisted dying has tended to remain strong in those places where it's been legalised, although there are some places where there have been ongoing ethical debates, such as extending eligibility to people with mental illnesses. What just about all these places have sought to do is to ensure that there are strict safeguards in place. Generally, these involve multiple medical opinions, waiting periods, mental competency assessments. Leadbeater has said that the lessons from those practical experiences will inform the detail of the bill and agreed changes as it progresses through the House. And a key distinction is whether the freedom is solely available for people who are suffering terminal illness, or whether it's also available for people who are not imminently dying but nevertheless unable to escape ongoing major suffering. The supporters of the measure argue that in those countries which is the majority, where the distinction is only those suffering terminal illness, there is no slippery slope effect in practice. The danger comes when you widen the definition to ongoing suffering. because then you immediately get grey area questions. How much suffering is enough to qualify? How do you objectively draw any kind of line? The UK bill, as testified by its very title, is clear that it is restricted to the terminally ill. That brings us to the question of whether the bill will actually become law. Firstly, it's worth noting one thing. I will agree with many that the UK political system has many weaknesses and frustrations, but I also think our approach to these sorts of moral questions is one of the best in the world. Moral questions that have included in the past the sorts of minefields that have lit up political conflict, such as abortion and the death penalty. In the UK, these sorts of debates are kept strictly non-party political. None of the major political parties is taking a party line, recognising there are strong feelings on both sides within their own group of MPs, and the question is not inherently one of ideology. As a result, the vote, if it gets to that, will be a free vote. No party whips. MPs will be free to vote with their consciences. Now, this has served the country well in the past, whereas the US has regularly been torn apart by political parties seizing on such deeply moral issues because they've become ways to mobilise their base and have become more and more politicised over the decades as they get used in that way. The UK has largely settled those questions, and once settled, they tend to remain settled, regardless of changes of government. Unless and until social attitudes have evolved so much that everyone recognises it's time for an update. And that's arguably where we are with this one. The mechanism for this bears explaining, because it's important to working out its chance of success. A private member's bill. Every year there's a ballot of all backbench MPs, and the top 20 in the ballot are given the opportunity to introduce a parliamentary bill. So, for example, the 1967 Abortion Act was a private member's bill introduced by the Liberal MP David Steele. Realistically, you have to be at least in the top 10 of the ballot to have a fair chance of getting enough parliamentary time to get your bill into law. Since these are not government bills, they're not guaranteed sufficient time, and this is somewhat exacerbated by the fact that private members' bills are debated on Fridays, when many MPs have gone back to carry out duties in their constituencies. That matters because it's possible to filibuster a bill on the floor of the House for MPs who are opposed to it simply to make lengthy speeches until it runs out of time. To prevent that, you need to have 100 MPs in the chamber who can then force a vote that the question now be put, the question now be voted upon. For many of those bills, getting 100 MPs into Parliament on a Friday is an ask too far, so they're unable to prevent their bill from being talked out. And it's been a real issue, because there are certain, usually Conservative MPs, who thoroughly dislike the private members' bill system, which they feel enabled bills to get passed without sufficient scrutiny, usually the sorts of bills that they wouldn't support, of course. So they routinely object and seek to bring down bills that are using that mechanism. However, in this case, on a question this big and this high profile, it is pretty certain that way more than 100 MPs would elect to be present for this debate. And that's helped by the fact that this bill was selected by the MP Kim Leadbeater, who came in at the very top of the ballot, the number one slot, more likely to get the time. Now, this isn't the first time the question has been debated, so you might presume that whatever happened last time will just be reiterated this time. After all, no fewer than 5 private members' bills attempted to overturn the Abortion Act over the subsequent 3 decades after it was passed, and they all failed. But in this case, it's a more open question. It's almost a decade since the last time a vote was held on this issue. On that occasion, it was indeed a huge vote against. 329 opposed to the bill, just 117 in favour. So you might think, surely it has no chance. Well, needless to say, quite a lot has changed since then. Most importantly, there has been a landslide election where the Conservative representation in Parliament was completely savaged, and a whole bunch of new, often younger, Labour MPs with no track record for us to go by then entered in their place. So it's an open question which way this new cohort of MPs will go, and there's a strong suspicion they will be much more open to agreeing the measure. So, what happens next? This week, the bill got its first reading. That literally just means the sponsor of the bill announces their chosen date for the second reading, which is when the first proper debate takes place. And in this case, Kim Leadbeater announced Friday, November the 29th. Assuming it gets through second reading, which it likely will given the high profile of the issue, it then goes to committee for detailed consideration. For a bill of this magnitude, this may include the opportunity for outside groups to submit evidence. To be fair, there has already been processes where evidence has been received. This isn't a process that's usually done for private members' bills, but there is flexibility to allow it. So if a committee decided to invite more evidence, that would certainly be possible. Then you get to the report stage, and that is the big moment, the vote that really counts. The bill returns to the House of Commons main chamber. Opponents can propose amendments. They may still be able to seek to run the bill out of time by tabling lots of amendments, although that has become rarer in recent years. If it's considered to be a key moral question, the government might well step in and offer extra time for the bill so that it reaches a final vote one way or the other. That happened in the past with private members' bills on abortion, on homosexuality legalisation and the death penalty. And indeed, before the election, the now Prime Minister Keir Starmer promised to allow parliamentary time for the issue if needed, and the current Health Secretary now has also reiterated the government would do so. Bills also, of course, have to go through the House of Lords, although the second chamber doesn't have the same tight time constraints that the Commons has. A survey by the newspaper suggested that more than half of the current MPs are, quote, supportive to some degree of legally assisted dying, which is a suitably ambiguous way of putting it. The fact that on a free vote for a fundamentally moral, non-party political question, MPs can and have changed their mind right up to the last minute. The debates on these issues tend therefore to be more interesting because the speeches are genuinely being made with real hope and intention of swaying opinions, and in a way that the standard party shouting matches never do. So there's a lot of ground to cover before we finally get to that end point, which will probably end up being around April next year. In the meantime, expect to hear a lot more about this issue in the UK from all sides of the argument.